The house might legally belong to me. But the power? That's what Karen, the HOA president, claimed for herself. She shrieked it loud enough to rattle the windows just before unlocking my front door with a spare key she should never have had. Problem for here, I wasn't home, but the police were waiting, handcuffs ready for someone who thought the HOA made her untouchable. What Karen didn't realize was I had seen this coming from the start, and this time, she was the one stepping over the legal line. What started out looking like a simple neighborhood dispute was about to spiral into something far more tangled than either of us imagined, and our calm little lakeside community about to become a war zone. Wherever you're watching this, you won't believe how the so-called queen of the HOA ended up destroying everything she built. Let me take you back to where it really began, the police station. Sitting across from Detective Lisa Chen in an interrogation room that smelled of stale coffee and tired regrets. "You want to know why Brenda Ashworth had an unauthorized key to your house?" Detective Chen asked, leaning back in her chair with the look of someone who's heard it all but knows this story might be different. I took a sip of the bitter station coffee, forcing a smile. "Detective, I'll tell you everything, but first, you need to understand. I saw this coming a mile away." 6 weeks earlier, I was driving my dented old Honda Civic through the winding streets of Lakeside Meadows, a neighborhood that could have been plucked straight out of a glossy real estate brochure. Immaculate lawns, identical mailboxes, houses worth more than what most people earn in 10 years. I wasn't there by choice. My Aunt Carla, who took me in after my parents died when I was 12, was losing her fight with cancer. She wanted to see me one last time. The irony stung. A cybersecurity expert used to shielding people from digital predators, about to inherit a house in a neighborhood ruled by a real-life one. Her funeral was small, just how Aunt Carla would have liked it. Maybe 30 mourners, mostly neighbors who remembered her as the kind soul who always had fresh cookies ready. I was standing near her casket, still grappling with the reality that I was alone in the world again, when the sharp click of high heels cut through the quiet. In walked Brenda Ashworth, mid-50s, her perfectly styled blonde hair probably costing more than my rent, and that smiley the kind that makes you instinctively check your pockets. "Excuse me," she said, her tone dripping authority. "Are you Jake Martinez, new owner of 47 Lakeview Drive 4? I nodded, baffled why anyone was talking property details at a funeral. Brenda pulled out a folder thicker than most novels and shoved it against my chest. "These are violation notices," she announced briskly. "The funeral home's hearse has been parked for over 2 hours, violating our parking ordinance, and the flowers don't match the approved neighborhood color palette." I stared at her, convinced this had to be some grief-induced hallucination. "Ma'am, this is a funeral. My aunt died 3 days ago." Unfazed, Brenda pulled out a tape measure and started checking the distance from the hearse to the curb right there in the funeral home parking lot, as people were still saying goodbye. "I know you're grieving," she said without even glancing up, "but the HOA's rules protect property values and community standards. Your aunt respected that. I trust you'll do the same." Later that night, once the last guest had left and I found myself alone in Aunt Carla's house, the silence weighed heavy. I wandered from room to room, running my hand across the keepsakes of the woman who saved me when I lost everything. Then, while sorting through her jewelry box, I discovered the letter hidden under the pearl necklace Uncle Paul had given her for their 25th anniversary. The handwriting was Shakukimo had done Fado, but the message couldn't have been clearer. "Jake, honey, Brenda has been trying to force me to sell the house for 3 years. She kept a spare key from when I was too sick to manage things myself. I changed the locks twice, but she always gets in somehow. I think she makes copies. Be careful, sweetheart. She isn't who she pretends to be." I sank onto Aunt Carla's old floral couch and read it again and again. Attached was a USB drive, with a note in the same trembling script. "Listen to this when you're ready for the truth." My hands shook as I plugged it into my laptop. As someone who works in cybersecurity, I thought I'd seen my share of secrets, but nothing prepared me for what played through my speakers. The first recording, dated 6 months earlier, captured Brenda on the phone, thinking the house was empty. "I'll have 15 houses this year. The old lady, Carla, is dying. Her nephew, just some computer geek. Once I get him to sign, Pinnacle Development can push ahead with Phase 2 of the lakefront project. I froze. Pinnacle Development, Phase 2? This wasn't about parking tickets, it was something far bigger. I went back to the folder Brenda shoved into my chest at the funeral, spreading it open across Aunt Carla's coffee table. 47 separate violations, each more absurd than the last. Grass too long by 2/10 of an inch, mailbox off by barely over an inch, a garden gnome that wasn't pre-approved by the architectural committee. Each fine ranged from $200 to $500. At the bottom of every notice was a shaky handwritten note from Aunt Carla. I never did any of these things. The second audio file was worse. Brenda talking to someone named Nathan about problem properties, discussing how targeted compliance pressure could convince owners to voluntarily sell. And then the third recording of Brenda laughing, bragging about how easy it was to pressure confused elderly homeowners into signing papers they didn't even understand. The real beauty of it, Brenda bragged in one recording, is that they think they're fighting City Hall, but really, they're fighting a losing battle against their own confusion. By the time I finished listening to all 47 audio files, I knew exactly what I was up against. This wasn't just a power-hungry HOA president. This was an organized scam wearing the polite mask of community management. I sat there in Aunt Carla's living room, surrounded by the furniture and photos that had been part of my childhood at the place where she'd taught me fractions and told me life would be okay, even when I didn't believe it. And I realized something. Brenda Ashworth thought she was dealing with some clueless city kid who would fold at the first threat. She had no idea she'd picked a fight with someone whose entire career revolved around outsmarting people who thought they were untouchable. So I opened my laptop and started typing. It was time to show the so-called HOA Queen what happened when she messed with the wrong family. Then, late at night, I discovered something that changed everything. Hidden in Aunt Carla's desk drawer, buried under old receipts and greeting cards, was a photocopy of the original 1987 HOA agreement. It spelled out, in black and white, that waterfront homes built before 1990 were exempt from new HOA rules because of their historic significance. Aunt Carla's house, built in 1985, was explicitly protected. Every violation notice Brenda had ever issued wasn't just petty, it was outright illegal, and I now had 47 pieces of evidence to prove it. Over the next 3 days, I combed through every file on that USB drive like it might somehow bring my aunt back. My cybersecurity background kicked in. I analyzed metadata, pieced together patterns, and treated the whole thing like a digital crime scene. Except this time, the victim wasn't a faceless companion. It was family. The audio files painted a picture worthy of a mob movie, a neighborhood protection racket disguised as compliance. Brenda's voice filled the empty house as I listened as she rehearsed intimidation speeches to an empty room like an actress warming up for the role of suburban tyrant. "I am the queen of this neighborhood," she declared to what I guessed was her bathroom mirror, "and everyone will listen to me, whether they like it or not." In another recording, she spoke casually with an accomplice about problem residents, discussing exactly how to push them into selling. The coldness in her tone when she talked about destroying people's lives made my skin crawl. I knew I had to go deeper, so I dug. That's when I found Detective Lisa Chen's name online. A few neighbors had mentioned her as someone who actually listened when people complained about HOA abuse. When I called her and mentioned Brenda Ashworth, there was a long pause. "Mr. Martinez," she finally said, "you're the 24th person to call me about Brenda in the last 2 years, but you're the first one with real evidence." We met at a downtown coffee shop where the exposed brick walls probably cost more than my entire car. Detective Chen looked exhausted, the kind of tired that comes from seeing injustice win too many times. She listened to 3 of the audio files, her expression shifting from professional interest to outrage. "This woman's been terrorizing an entire neighborhood," she said, her voice sharp. "But until now, no one's dared to go public." She told me about Roberto Valdez, or Boba, a former private investigator who'd lived 2 streets over. Bob had tried to catch Brenda, but she was slippery. "She's clever," Chen admitted, "but she got cocky. And that's always the mistake." Bob agreed to meet that evening. We sat on the balcony of his small apartment, a far cry from the lakeside view Brenda had forced him to sell for 40% under market value. She had spare keys to at least a dozen homes, Bob said, staring into the distance. She claimed it was for emergencies, but what she really did was sneak in when people weren't home, move mailboxes, overwater lawns to kill the grass, plant unapproved flowers, anything to create violations. She hadn't just been fining people, she'd been gaslighting them into believing they were careless homeowners. While Bob spoke, my mind raced through digital possibilities. Brenda had to know exactly when people left their home as she was too precise to rely on guesswork. It took me 4 hours to break into the HOA's so-called security system. Its password strength was laughably like putting a padlock on an open window. What I found made my heart drop. Brenda had been using the HOA's security cameras to track residents' comings and goings. She knew when Aunt Carla left for doctor's appointments, when Bob went grocery shopping, and when every house would be empty. Worse yet, logs showed she'd planted GPS trackers on cars. At 3 a.m., she'd sneak into parking areas to install them, then issue violation notices when people weren't home long enough. I printed everything: camera logs, GPS data, timestamps, all matched perfectly with the violations she'd mailed out like candy on Halloween. Finally, I called Brenda. I'd like to meet to discuss my aunt's violations, I told her. Her response said it all. Those recordings you have, those are private conversations. In that moment, I knew she was guilty and terrified. And I was just getting started. She said it, her voice strained, tinged with panic she could barely hide. And I have every right to keep those keys for community security purposes. Except my aunt had never signed anything giving Brenda permission to stalk Kira, and we both knew it. Miss Ashworth, I replied evenly, forcing my voice to stay calm and professional. I think there's been a misunderstanding about what authority the HOA actually has. Her laugh was cold and brittle, like glass cracking. Mr. Martinez, you're new here, so let me explain how things work. I protect this community's property values, and if that means keeping a close eye on problem residents, then that's what I do. That night, at exactly 2:47 a.m., the alarm on my newly installed security system shrieked to life. I pulled up the live feed and watched Brenda Ashworth unlock my front door with a key, strolling in like she owned the place. She stood in my living room for a full minute, looking around as if she were picking out furniture, then casually walked through the house. The woman had just committed breaking and entering, but with the arrogance of someone who'd never once faced consequences. Catching her red-handed at 2:47 a.m. should have ended it. Instead, it was only the start. The next morning, I confronted her. I showed up at her door holding printed screenshots from my security footage. Her reaction? Classic Brenda. She didn't deny it, didn't apologize, didn't even bother to look embarrassed. Instead, she smiled sweetly and invited me in for coffee, like we were neighbors chatting about weekend plans. I was conducting an interior compliance inspection, she explained, pouring coffee from a machine that probably cost more than my car. The wall color in your living room violates HOA Guideline 15C regarding approved interior paint schemes. I stared at her, trying to decide if she was delusional or just so corrupt she'd forgotten to pretend otherwise. Brenda, you broke into my house. In the middle of the night. She waved it away, as if I'd just complained about a noisy neighbor. I used my emergency access key to ensure community standards were being maintained, she said, almost bored. I have the authority to inspect any property for violations. Then she pulled out a professional color-matching device, flipping through a notebook filled with handwritten notes. In just 20 minutes inside my home, she'd documented 52 supposed violations: the color of my walls, the placement of my furniture, the magnets on my fridge, even the arrangement of Aunt Carla's books. According to Brenda, my coffee table was 2.3 inches too far from the sofa, my laptop on the kitchen counter constituted an unapproved home office, and the magnets created visual clutter inconsistent with neighborhood aesthetics. It was so absurd, it almost felt like performance art. That's when I knew I needed help, and not the psychiatric kind, but the legal kind. I called Sophia Williams, a 29-year-old lawyer specializing in consumer rights and HOA disputes. She had her own history with Brenda. 2 years earlier, Brenda had tried to wreck Sophia's career by filing bogus ethics complaints with the state bar. That woman reported me for practicing law without neighborhood approval when I represented the Hendersons in their HOA fight. Sophia told me during our meeting, She actually argued that lawyers need HOA permission to take local clients. Sophia's office was decorated with legal awards, but what caught my eye was a corkboard labeled Brenda's Greatest Hits. Absurd violation notices she'd collected over the years, a fine for excessively festive Christmas lights, a complaint about kids' chalk drawings on a driveway, labeled unauthorized street art, a violation for planting sunflowers without submitting a tall flower impact assessment. But Sophia wasn't just angry, she was tactical. "We're going to give Brenda exactly what she wants," Sophia said, spreading documents across her conference table like a general planning a siege. "She wants to play by the rules? Fine, let's see how she handles someone who actually knows what the rules are." The plan was elegant. I'd pretend to be the intimidated new resident scared of the big, bad HOA president while secretly collecting every illegal thing she did. Tommy Chen, Detective Lisa Chen's older brother and a professional security consultant, helped me turn Aunt Carla's house into a digital fortress. Hidden cameras in every room, motion sensors that alerted my phone instantly, and direct emergency integration with the local police if she breaks in using an unauthorized key, Tommy explained while finishing the setup. It triggers a federal alert and it counts as identity theft and unlawful entry. The genius of the plan was that Brenda's arrogance would do the work for us. I called her, and did my best imitation of the nervous, compliant nephew. "Miss Ashworth," I began, voice shaky, "I've been thinking about what you said." "You're right, I'm new here. I clearly don't understand how the HOA works. I'm going to be out of town for 3 days on business. And I was hoping you could keep an eye on the house. Make sure it stays in compliance." The silence that followed was so long, I thought she'd hung up. Then she cleared her throat, and I could almost hear her calculating how much trouble she could cause with 3 days alone inside. "Of course, Mr. Martinez," she purred. "That's exactly the kind of community responsibility the HOA provides. If any violations need to be addressed, I'll take care of them." It was like watching a spider crawl into its own web. Brenda thought she'd been handed 3 days to plant evidence, create violations, and maybe help herself to anything valuable. What she'd really been handed was 3 days to incriminate herself on camera over and over again. So I packed my bag. I made a big show of loading my car and drove just 2 blocks away to a hotel, where I could monitor the security cameras and wait for Brenda to make the biggest mistake of her life. The first text came only 6 hours after I'd left town. It was from Brenda, phrased like she was doing me a favor. "Noticed your sprinkler system running too long. Took the liberty of adjusting it to prevent water waste violations. Also found several interior compliance issues that need immediate attention. I'll handle them personally to save you the hassle of fines." She was telling me, outright, that she'd already broken into my house and planned to do it again. Tomorrow night, when she believed I was safely out of state, Brenda Ashworth would stroll through my front door with that illegal key. Only this time, she wouldn't be walking back out. The plan felt foolproof until my phone rang at 6:32 a.m. with the kind of call that makes your blood run cold. "Mr. Martinez, this is Sandra from Sunset Manor." The voice on the line trembled. "I'm calling about your mother, Margaret Santos. A family member picked her up yesterday evening with proper medical authorization papers. We assumed you'd arranged her transfer to a specialized facility." My stomach dropped. "What family member? What are you talking about?" Sandra's voice grew even shakier. "A well-dressed blonde woman, around 50. She said she was your sister-in-law, had medical transport paperwork and claimed Margaret needed immediate care because you'd been in an accident." The description hit me like a sledgehammer. Brenda, she had crossed a line escalating from harassment to kidnapping a 70-year-old woman with early-stage dementia. She had a medical power of attorney document. Sandra continued. "Your mother seemed to recognize Hero, called her the nice lady from Jake's neighborhood." While she spoke, I was already throwing clothes into a bag. This wasn't about HOA violations anymore. This was about my mother's safety. "Sandra, listen carefully," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "Call the police right now. This is a kidnapping. I never authorized anyone to pick up my mother, and I wasn't in an accident." The silence on the other end felt like an eternity. "Mr. Martin's a broken bar." The paperwork looked legitimate. The woman knew so many details: your mother's condition, medications, Even her favorite food's a broken bar. That's when it all clicked. I grabbed my laptop and opened the old USB files Aunt Carla had left me, searching desperately. In file 31, recorded 3 months ago, Brenda's voice came through, cold and calculating. The nephew has a mother in Sunset Manor, early dementia, very trusting, still mobile. If we need additional pressure, she could be useful. I've already visited her twice. I introduced myself as a neighborhood friend. My hands shook as I listened. She had been planning this for months, gaining my mother's trust, studying her medical condition, waiting for the moment to strike. The beauty of dementia patients, Brenda's voice continued, almost casually, is that they're confused about what's real and what isn't. It's very easy to convince them something urgent has happened and they need to come with you immediately. I called Dr. Amanda Foster, my mother's psychiatrist, and she confirmed my worst fear. Mr. Martinez, a woman called last week asking detailed questions about your mother's treatment. She claimed she was coordinating care with family. I didn't give her new information, a broken bar, but she already seemed to know so much. The rage in my chest burned white hot. Brenda had been hunting my family like prey. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, but I recognized the style immediately. It was from my mother's phone. But the words were Brenda's. Jake, honey, I'm safe and getting good care. The nice lady from your neighborhood explained you were hurt and needed me to sign some papers so you could get better. She's taking very good care of me at this lovely facility. Don't worry about anything, just sign the house papers and I'll be home soon. Love, Mom. It was so painfully fake it would have been laughable if it weren't so terrifying. My mother had never sent a text message in her life, especially not one with perfect punctuation, but it told me exactly what I needed to know. Brenda was holding my mother hostage to force me to sign over Aunt Carla's house. This was no longer harassment, it was extortion and kidnapping. Using my cybersecurity skills, I traced the GPS location of my mother's phone. The signal came from an industrial area on the edge of Tona, old warehouses near the railroad tracks. When I got there, I found exactly what I expected, a run-down building dressed up to look like a medical facility, complete with fake signs and a parking lot full of cars that probably belonged to Brenda's accomplices. I couldn't just rush in and out with my mother inside and no idea how many people Brenda had with her. Instead, I parked across the street and called Detective Lisa Chen. Detective, I need to report a kidnapping and I have evidence linking it directly to Brenda Ashworth. Her response was immediate, calm, and firm. Where are you, Mr. Martinez? Don't do anything until we get there. While I waited for the police, another text arrived from my mother's phone. This one was blunt, almost openly threatening. Jake, if you want to see your mother again, meet me at your house tonight at 8 p.m. Bring the signed deed transfer papers. No police, no lawyers, just you, me, and the paperwork that makes this all go away. Your mother's comfort depends entirely on your cooperation. The GPS tracker still showed my mother's phone at the warehouse, which meant Brenda was planning to leave my mother at the warehouse while she came to collect the house deed from me, but that was exactly what I'd been counting on. At 8 p.m. tonight, Brenda Ashworth was going to use her illegal key to walk through my front door one last time, and this time, she'd step straight into the trap I'd spent 3 days preparing. While Detective Chen coordinated the surveillance team near the warehouse, I did what I did best, dig deeper into the digital evidence. Using my remote access to the neighborhood security cameras, I traced Brenda's movements over the past 6 months. What I uncovered made my blood run cold. This wasn't just about me or my mother. Brenda had been systematically targeting elderly residents across the entire neighborhood, and my mother was only one victim among many. The footage revealed a chilling, methodical pattern. Every few weeks, Brenda singled out an elderly resident who lived alone or whose family was far away. She'd spend months cultivating trust, showing up with casseroles, offering to help with errands or yard work until she became part of their daily lives. Then the manipulation would start. Late-night calls warning of neighborhood emergencies, fake medical scares demanding immediate signatures on urgent documents. Always the same endgame, getting confused, frighten people to sign away their homes. I called Harold Peterson, a 74-year-old retired engineer who lived on the corner. He'd kept meticulous notes in a small leather journal, and he didn't hesitate to share what he'd seen. "Son," Harold's voice crackled with hard-won certainty, "I spent 40 years designing bridges, and I know sabotage when I see it. She's been moving old folks out like it's an evacuation drill." His observations were damning. Elena Rodriguez, a 69-year-old widow with the most valuable lakefront property, had disappeared 2 weeks ago. Dorothy Kim, a retired teacher, had supposedly transferred to a better care facility, but no one had heard from her since. Frank Williams, a former police officer, had been missing for 10 days. That was 4 residents gone in 6 weeks, and each time, Brenda showed up soon after with paperwork claiming they'd chosen to sell their homes for health reasons. The scale of her operation fully hit me when I hacked into Brenda's email. Her password, a Queen B123A, was either brazen arrogance or staggering stupidity, maybe both. What I found would make a federal prosecutor weep with gratitude. She had been emailing someone named Nathan Cross, her apparent partner in what they called Project Clearwater. The emails included floor plans, financial projections, and strategy documents detailing how to transition elderly residents out of their homes. They predicted over $10 million in profits from Phase 2 of the lakefront redevelopment. Even more incriminating were her emails with Pinnacle Development Corporation. Black and white proof of the conspiracy. Pinnacle had already paid Brenda $2.8 million to clear 15 properties in Phase 1. Phase 2, worth an additional $8 million, would expand to the rest of the lakefront area, transforming it into Pinnacle Luxury Resort and Marina, a playground for wealthy tourists. Brenda wasn't just an overzealous HOA president. She was orchestrating a sophisticated criminal enterprise. Nathan Cross, her partner, was described as a specialist in elderly care transitions, a polite corporate euphemism for professional kidnapper. The fake medical facility where my mother and the others were held was labeled in the emails as a temporary processing center to prepare residents for relocation. One email from 3 weeks ago chilled me to the bone. "The Martinez property is the final piece we need for Phase 2, Brenda had written. "The nephew is a potential problem, but we have contingency plans in place. His mother is already in our care rotation and will provide excellent leverage. I estimate we can have him signing transfer documents within 72 hours of activation." Activation, a clean, corporate word for ruining lives. It was all laid out as if they were discussing quarterly targets, not human beings. What I had taken for petty harassment was actually a months-long campaign of fraud, coercion, and kidnapping. And according to the emails, I was their final obstacle before they moved on to the next neighborhood. At 7:21 p.m., my phone buzzed. Detective Chen texted, "Surveillance confirms at least 4 elderly victims inside the warehouse. Need 2 more hours to coordinate with federal backup. Do not engage Brenda until we give the all clear." But time wasn't something I had. At exactly 7:45 p.m., I heard the sound that started all of this. A key turning in my front door. Brenda Ashworth, right on schedule, walking in like she owned the place, completely unaware she was walking into a trap. Through my security cameras, I watched her step into my living room. Same smug, confident smile she'd worn at Aunt Carla's funeral. She pulled out a thick folder of forged legal documents, ready to force me to sign. She had no idea that the police were watching her through my cameras, that federal agents were closing in on the warehouse, or that the quiet computer nerd had turned her own tactics against her. "Showtime," I whispered to myself, stepping out from the kitchen. 8 p.m. sharp, Brenda's illegal key clicked in the lock, a final, fatal mistake. And as I walked forward to confront her, I knew this was the moment everything changed. The night the predator finally learned what it meant to become the prey. From the kitchen doorway, I watched Brenda stroll into my living room with the entitled confidence of someone who'd never faced a real consequence in her entire life. She wore a tailored navy blue business suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary and carried a sleek leather briefcase lightly stuffed with forged documents that already bore my signature. "The house might be in your name," she announced to what she thought was an empty room, "but the control belongs to me." Her voice had that same imperious ring she'd used at my aunt's funeral, as if she were addressing a gathering of subordinates instead of standing alone in someone else's home. She paused in the center of the living room, surveying it like a conquering general, completely unaware she was being watched by half the county's police force. "Mr. Martinez," she called out, her tone dripping with manufactured patience. "I know you're here somewhere. Let's get this over with so your mother can come home." That was my cue. I stepped out of the kitchen, keeping my expression calm. The look on Brenda's face was worth every hour of lost sleep over the past 3 days. Her eyes flickered from surprise to suspicion to confusion as she tried to understand why I wasn't terrified. "Hello, Brenda," I said evenly. "Thanks for coming, and thank you for using your illegal key to break into my house again." "I didn't break in," she snapped, recovering her composure with the practiced ease of someone used to lying her way out of anything. "I used my emergency access key to conduct a welfare check when residents ignore HOA communications. I am authorized to ensure their safety." She whipped out her phone, snapping photos of my living room like she was documenting some fabricated violation. And that's when Detective Lisa Chen stepped out of the hallway bathroom, flanked by Detective Rodriguez and 2 uniformed officers who'd been waiting in my bedroom. Brenda's mask cracked in an instant. Her confident smirk vanished, replaced by a flicker of disbelief, then panic. "Brenda Ashworth," Detective Chen began, her voice hard and calm, the voice of someone who'd waited 2 years for this moment. "You're under arrest for breaking and entering, kidnapping, extortion, and conspiracy to commit fraud." "This is ridiculous," Brenda shrieked, her composure shattering like glass. "I have every right to be here. I am the HOA president. I was conducting an inspection." She waved her phone in front of the officers like it was some sort of magical shield. "I have photographic evidence of multiple violations. This man has been ignoring community standards." A Detective Chen's smile was sharp, cold. "Miss Ashworth, we've been tracking your activities for weeks. We know about the warehouse, we know about Nathan Cross, and we know about the 4 elderly residents you've been holding there." She nodded toward Detective Rodriguez, who stepped forward to read Brenda her rights. Brenda tried to protest, sputtering about bylaws and property codes, but then she made the biggest mistake of all. She kept talking. "You don't understand what you're interfering with," she blurted out, her voice climbing toward hysteria. "Nathan and the Pinnacle team are expecting me back at the warehouse before 10. If I don't show, they'll move the residents to the secondary facility, and you'll never find them." Detective Chen and I exchanged a quick, silent look. Brenda had just confirmed the victims were alive, given us a time linear and revealed there was a backup location. "What secondary facility, Brenda?" Detective Chen pressed, pulling out her notepad. "And how many residents exactly?" Backed into a corner, Brenda couldn't seem to stop herself. "5, she spat out, gesturing wildly with her cuffed hands. "Margaret Santos, Harold Peterson, Elena Rodriguez, Dorothy Kim, and Frank Williams. If something goes wrong, Nathan will move them to the old textile plant on Industrial Boulevard." The words hit me like a punch. Harold Peterson, the retired engineer who'd been helping me document her crime, was one of the victims. The man who'd risked so much to help me had been kidnapped right under my nose. "When did you take Harold?" I asked, my voice raw with anger. Brenda gave me a look of contempt. 3 days ago, right after you called him." "Did you really think we weren't monitoring your communications?" She laughed, a brittle, sharp sound that made my skin crawl. "Nathan's been tracking your calls, your emails, your credit card purchases. We knew you were building a case against me before you even knew it yourself." Detective Rodriguez stepped forward, holding out an evidence bag. "Miss Ashworth, we're going to need that briefcase." Brenda clutched it to her chest like it held her soul. "You can't take this. It's protected confidential HOA documents." But when Detective Rodriguez pried it open, it wasn't bylaws or meeting minutes inside. Instead, we found forged property deeds for 15 homes in the neighborhood, each one carefully signed with fake homeowner signatures. Even worse, there were psychological profiles for every elderly resident in Lakeside Meadows and notes about their medical histories, family situations, cognitive decline, and vulnerabilities. Brenda had studied them the way a hunter studies prey. And then there was the checklist, at the top, written in Brenda's precise handwriting, "Acquisition Protocol." It read like a cold-blooded manual for exploitation, step-by-step instructions on isolating victims, manipulating them into signing documents, and covering their tracks. One chilling section was titled, "The Beauty of Dementia Patients." Is there natural confusion about time and relationships? Introduce yourself as a family friend. Create urgency around a fake emergency, and they'll follow you anywhere. Another section described how to forge medical documents to justify moving residents to care facilities without family consent. Standing there, I realized the woman I'd thought of as nothing more than a cruel, petty tyrant had been running a criminal empire built on fear, deception, and the systematic destruction of vulnerable lives. And finally, thanks to a stolen key, a hidden camera feed, and a few good people willing to fight back, her empire was about to fall. Among the evidence spilling out of Brenda's briefcase, the most damning pieces were at the bottom. Neatly tucked away, we found forged authorization papers and fake facility documents designed to look official enough to fool nursing home staff. But it was the USB drive labeled financial records that sealed everything. On it were bank statements showing direct payments from Pinnacle Development Corporation totaling $2.8 million over the last 18 months. Brenda hadn't just built a criminal empire, she'd gotten rich doing it. Detective Chen's radio crackled to life, cutting through the heavy silence. "Detective, this is Unit 7 at the warehouse. We've breached the building and secured 5 elderly victims, all alive and in stable condition. We also have 3 suspects in custody, including Nathan Cross." The relief that washed over me was overwhelming. My mother and the others were safe. Brenda, being escorted to the door by Detective Rodriguez, shot me a venomous look. "You have no idea what you've done," she hissed. "Pinnacle has lawyers, connections, money. This isn't over." Detective Chen answered with a small, cold smile. "Brenda, it is over. We've been coordinating with federal investigators. Pinnacle's top executives were arrested about an hour ago. Your little criminal empire just became a federal case." The last thing I heard as they led her away was her voice rising in a shrill scream, ranting about property values and community standards. Still convinced she was the true victim, through my front window, I watched them put her in the back of a squad car. For the first time, the handcuffs were on the person who truly deserved them. The aftermath unfolded like dominoes, each piece toppling the next in perfect, inevitable sequence. Within 24 hours, the criminal operation Brenda had built so carefully came crashing down. The warehouse raid hadn't just rescued the 5 victims, it had netted Nathan Cross, 2 accomplices posing as medical staff, and enough evidence to keep federal prosecutors busy for years. But real vindication came the next morning, when Detective Chen called me. "Jake," she said, her voice edged with satisfaction, "we've arrested Richard Sterling, Pinnacle CEO, along with 3 senior executives. And get these, Brenda wasn't just working with them, she pitched the entire operation. She was the mastermind." It turned out Brenda had sold Pinnacle on her elderly relocation project as a way to snatch up prime lakefront properties far below market value. Sterling had been so impressed with her results, he'd given her full operational control and an even bigger budget. Then came the second and even more shocking revelation. Federal investigators discovered Brenda's scheme wasn't limited to Lakeside Meadows. She'd set up similar scams in 4 other upscale neighborhoods across the state, using the same cold precision. The scope was staggering: 127 properties stolen, 89 elderly victims, over $47 million in real estate fraud. And karma wasn't done yet. The FBI found her private journal hidden in a safe at her home. In it, Brenda had kept twisted, meticulous notes on everyone she saw as a potential threat: city council members, police, journalists, and even federal agents. She'd been planning to expand her operation at targeting the families of anyone who dared stand in her way. The story exploded across local and national news. Every channel ran footage of Brenda being marched out in handcuffs, still shrieking about mailbox heights and grass length. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The HOA tyrant who tormented neighbors over lawn colors was now in an orange jumpsuit, facing 31 federal charges. The reunion with my mother and the other victims was a moment I'll never forget. Despite being 74 and held captive for days, Harold Peterson, the retired engineer who had quietly helped me gather evidence, he managed to document every detail of the warehouse in his dog-eared notebook. "Son," he told me as EMTs checked him over, That woman underestimated what happens when you mess with people who lived through the Depression, 2 wars, and a lifetime of red tape. We may be old, but we're not stupid. Elena Rodriguez, the widow who owned the lakefront house Brenda had wanted so badly, summed it up perfectly for reporters outside the warehouse. "I'm 71 years old, and I've dealt with bullies my whole life. The difference is, this time a broken bar. The bully picked the wrong neighborhood. It turned out the victims Brenda had targeted weren't helpless at all. They were survivors who'd simply been outmaneuvered, for a time, by someone who'd studied their weaknesses." Dorothy Kim, the retired teacher, had secretly documented everything she saw during her captivity, scribbling notes on scraps of paper she hid in her clothing. Frank Williams, Sophia's father and a retired police officer, had quietly been working on an escape plan that likely would have worked if we hadn't rescued them first. In the end, Brenda faced swift and unforgiving justice. Federal prosecutors charged her with 31 counts, including kidnapping, elder abuse, fraud, extortion, and racketeering under the RICO Act. The evidence was so overwhelming that her lawyer convinced her to plead guilty for a reduced sentence, 25 years in federal prison without parole and $6.2 million in restitution to her victims. Nathan Cross and his accomplices each received prison terms ranging from 15 to 20 years. Meanwhile, Richard Sterling and Pinnacle's senior executives were convicted on money laundering and conspiracy charges, earning them sentences that meant their golden years would be spent behind bars rather than aboard luxury yachts. But the best part of the aftermath was what happened to the neighborhood itself. With Brenda gone and her absurd, illegal HOA rule struck down, the community finally had the chance to become what it should have always been, a place where neighbors actually cared about each other, rather than obsessing over mailbox height and grass length. We elected Harold Peterson, whose quiet strength had helped bring Brenda down, as our new HOA president. His very first act, eliminating 80% of Brenda's ridiculous regulations. The warehouse where Brenda had kept her victims was purchased by the county and transformed into the Lakeside Community Senior Center, a space for meals, medical care, and social activities. The irony of turning Brenda's prison into a place of support wasn't lost on anyone, least of all Harold. He insisted on hanging a plaque by the front door that reads, "Dedicated to the principle that a community's strength comes from protecting its most vulnerable members, not exploiting them." As for me, I kept Aunt Carla's house and turned it into what she would have wanted, a home always open to family and neighbors. My mother moved in after everything, and once she felt safe and loved again, her memory started to improve. In the evenings, we sit on the porch and watch kids play in the yard. Brenda once patrolled with a ruler in hand. Sometimes, I get letters from people in other neighborhoods fighting their own HOA tyrants, asking how to fight back. My answer is always the same: document everything, know your rights. And remember, bullies only win when good people stay silent. We've all felt powerless at times, whether it's against an HOA dictator, a workplace bully, or anyone who thinks the rules don't apply to them. But this story proves something important. With patience, evidence, and the right strategy, even the most untouchable bullies can fall. Have you ever faced someone who thought they were above the law? Share your story in the comments below. And if this tale of sweet, long overdue justice resonated with you, like and subscribe to YA Stories for more true stories where good people win. Thanks for watching. And remember, if they ever accuse Robust B of being a public nuisance, you're in the right place. Her story brings the chaos, the concrete, and the currents of broken bar all wrapped in legal gray areas. And her surprise? Watching property values drop just from association.